Well, I know something from talking to many of you, and this is not unusual, I don't think, for our church either, is a number of you, now that you're back from vacation, you're making an extra focus on prayer. And a lot of people do that. They get back from vacation, and they want to focus on getting their relationship with God right. Perhaps during the summer with traveling, etc., things went a little bit off, and now they're trying to refocus on it. And this morning, I want to talk with you a little bit about prayer, but from a different perspective that might seem to some of you a little bit heretical. Because I want to talk to you about times when prayer doesn't work. When prayer doesn't work. The scriptures over and over again tell us that we need to be in prayer. Paul told the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians 5, pray continually. And in Ephesians chapter 6, he told them, the Ephesians, pray at all times in the Spirit. And again, in Colossians, Paul could not have stated it any clearer when he said, continue steadfastly in prayer. So don't hear anything that I say today as to say that we shouldn't pray or prayer isn't important. It's absolutely vital. But it's nonetheless true that there are things in our life that can hinder our prayer lives. And if your prayer life is not what you want it to be, it might be, and this takes discernment, because it might not be, but it might be because one of these things. In your bulletin, there's an outline, and you can follow along with that and mark in the spots if you'd like. So when does prayer not work? Number one, prayer does not work if there is unconfessed sin in your life. All of us sin. But if we have unconfessed sin that we are refusing to forsake, that can and will interfere with our prayer life. And not only that, but you know what happens? God, and at least this is the case with me, God brings me up short. And he somehow will bring out something that I'm trying to hide and force me to deal with it. The first case I ever had of that was when I was 3 years old. How many of you remember back in the 60s, I don't know if there was in New Brunswick or not, but Nova Scotia had two main grocery stores. One was Sobeys and the other was Dominion. Okay, Ernie, you're my age. Well, I went one day with my mother to get groceries. I was 3 years old in the Dominion store. And really, this is more of an indictment of my mother than myself. But I made a very reasonable request of her. I wanted a chocolate bar. And my mother, cruel woman that she was, said no. You know, it's a wonder I turned out as well as I did, given my home life. But she said no. And so I decided to do the only option that was really left for me. I took a chocolate bar anyways. And I snuck out behind a pile of potatoes and was enjoying this said chocolate bar when, and I suspect the Lord was behind this, the manager walked by. And he looked at me. He knew my mother. He knew me. We were in every week. And he said, young man, did your mother give you that? And I said, Well, long story short, he took me by the hand, led me to my mother, and my secret came out. And this, I won't go into the consequences of that. It was pretty ugly. Let's just leave it at that. But this is what happens when there's unconfessed sin in our lives. It interferes with our relationship with God, and oftentimes God will force it to come out. A much more serious example of it, as some of you may be aware, is what's happened with Willow Creek Community Church in Chicago, on the suburbs of Chicago, with Bill Hybels. And I don't know all the details, and I don't really care to know all the details, but it appears that Bill Hybels had some secret sin in his life going back many, many years, and it all came out, and he was forced into an early retirement, and that's what happens. And so, my encouragement for you, my plea for you, is if there is unconfessed sin in your life, deal with it. Confess it to the Lord. Get some support and some encouragement from people in your life who can encourage you and hold you accountable. We were never meant to live the Christian life on our own. And all of us need that support, the encouragement, the accountability that comes from someone who we trust, letting them in on what we're struggling with. The scriptures say in Psalm 66, if I had cherished sin in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. And that's what we need to take to heart. You don't want this type of thing interfering with your prayer life and your spiritual growth. Second area that will interfere with our prayer life, and I've done this, you've done this, if we're praying for our own selfish gain. There are times that we just want something for ourselves, and we're going to bang the gates of heaven trying to get it, whether it's good for us or not, or whether it's needed or not. James talked about it with the people of his day. He said, you desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. It's important to ask if our prayers are me-focused or other-focused. Reminds me of a young woman who was always praying that God would bring a handsome young man into her life. And finally, her mother challenged her and she said, why don't you stop praying for yourself and pray sometimes for others? And so she took this to heart, and at the next prayer time, she said, Lord, there is a young man out there who needs a beautiful young woman like myself. Please help him. And that's the way we are sometimes. There's nothing wrong with praying for ourselves. We should do that. But if we're just praying for our own advantage, for things that we want selfishly, then that will hinder our prayer lives. Third, oh boy, and this is one that I was called up short on many years ago because of this young girl over here to my left. It will interfere, your prayer life will not be what it should be if you are, number 3, neglecting your family. Neglecting your family. Peter said, husbands, in the same way be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect, and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Peter is saying that how we treat our family has a direct impact on our prayers. And many years ago, when Josie was 3 years old, I was just one more night heading out the door for a church meeting, and she brought a little game up to me and asked me to play. And I said, honey, I can't. I've got to go to church for a meeting. And I'll never forget, she said to me, Daddy, are you going to church again? And I tell you, those words stung. And I realized that I was forsaking the first and most important obligation that I had, responsibility that I had. And I had to spend some time looking at my time management and my priorities, because I knew that it would impact my spiritual life and the spiritual life of my daughter. Make sure that your family is not being neglected in your life, particularly, and we always need volunteers in the church. We always need more. And I hope everyone's involved in something. But if your family is being neglected because you are involved in church, I would rather have you back out of some things than carry on in that situation. Fourth, our prayers will be hindered if we are praying for our own will rather than God's. This is what John said in 1 John chapter 5. This is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have what we asked of him. And Paul said to the Romans, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. In other words, we are to seek not our own will, but God's will. Why? Because we don't always know what's best for us. God does. When I was a teenager, I was dating this young woman, and I was absolutely convinced that she was God's will for my life. And I prayed and prayed and prayed that God would keep us together. I wasn't praying for God's will, I was praying for my will. And today I am so thankful that God didn't answer that prayer, because it would not have ended well, and I would not have met the young woman who became my wife, which didn't end well for her. But that's another story. God can't do everything. You know, it's become the mantra of our culture today, that Frank Sinatra song, I did it my way. We're not called to do it my way. We're called to do it God's way, because God knows what we need. We always don't. We don't always. But God does. And it's hard sometimes to be honest and to surrender what we want to the perfect will of God. But when we do, we know we're in good hands. The last two I'm going to put together because they're very closely connected. Number 5, your prayer life will be affected. Number 5, if you are neglecting to speak out against injustice. And number 6, you are not doing what you can to help. Look at what the scriptures say in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? What does the Lord require of you, Micah asks, but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Those are God's priorities for us. And James said to the Christians of his day, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is a sin for them. And in chapter 2, he says a similar thing. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? We are reminded over and over and over again in Scripture of God's care and concern for the poor. In fact, there are over 2,000 verses in the Bible that speaks about God's concern for the poor. Now, we can't help every poor person in the world, every person suffering from some form of injustice, but if God has laid an issue on your heart, it could be something to do with poverty. We have a number in our church who are involved in helping the issue of sex trafficking. And they are working to see what difference we can make in that area. Others are involved with immigrants and refugees. Others are involved with indigenous people. Some may be involved with issues to do with racism, some with misogyny. The question is, has God laid an issue of justice on your heart? If he has, get involved, because this will interfere with your prayer life if you don't, and it'll be an amazing blessing to you if you do respond. So my encouragement for you this morning, as you focus in, and I hope all of you will be, focus in on prayer this fall, on your relationship with God. Look at things that may be hindering your prayer life and ask the Lord to grant you the wisdom, the insight, the self-reflection that you need to get things straight and right. If there's anything that we as a pastoral team can support and encourage you in, let us know. If you have a mature Christian friend, share with them a little bit about what you see the Lord saying to you as well. This is an opportunity this fall to really say, Lord, I'm going to focus on you and your priorities.